If the main house is like a settled island of calm in the middle of a wet landscape, then the small shelters scattered further out are like stepping stones, temporary bits of order placed in the open, just enough to rest in before moving on. In the wide, windy reaches of peatland and moor, people did not always have time to return home each evening. Animals needed tending, peat needed cutting and stacking. Fishing, hunting, and seasonal work pulled bodies far from their hearths. But even when you are far from home, you still need somewhere for the day's dampness to stop. You need a place where your shoulders can drop, where your boots can steam a little by a fire, where the wind does not knife straight through your clothes. In bog country, those needs gave rise to the smallest cousins of the turf-roofed house, little huts built from the same materials, leaning into the same quiet partnership with peat and moss. Imagine a wide, open moorland in late afternoon. The sky is large and a little colorless, a pale dome with clouds drifting low. The ground is patched with heather, moss, and peat cuttings. Here and there, rectangular scars mark where blocks were taken from the earth and then partly refilled, their edges softened by new growth. In the distance, a ridge of low hills darkens the horizon. Wind moves across everything, lifting the tips of grasses, bending small shrubs, combing through your clothing. On such a day, you might notice, at first only as a small irregularity, a faint mound with a darker spot, an opening. As you walk closer, the shape resolves into a hut, barely taller than a person, perhaps not even that. Its walls are made of stacked turf and peat, the green sides outward, the darker, soil-rich sides turned in. The roof is a simple slope of sod and moss laid over a skeleton of poles. It looks less like a building and more like a chunk of ground that has been gently folded up over an empty space. These huts go by many local names, but their purpose is always simple: to borrow a bit of dryness from the bog itself. They are not meant to last as long as houses. They lean into the wind, weather-stained and sometimes listing slightly. Inside, they are cramped, smoky, and dim. Yet to someone who has spent all day in driving rain or mist, stamping through waterlogged ground, that dimness and crampedness feels like stepping into the cupped palm of a hand. Duck your head and go in. The threshold is just a rough stone or an old plank. The doorway is low enough that even a child must stoop. As you pass through, the wind falls away almost instantly, dropping from a howl to a muted murmur. Outside it was everywhere. Inside, it is reduced to a faint seeping sound along the roof edge. The interior walls are turf blocks laid in alternating courses, their seams filled with moss. Some of the moss is still faintly green where it peeks through. Other patches have turned a soft beige from smoke and age. The floor is beaten earth with a thin top layer of peat crumbs and old heather. In one corner, a tiny hearth has been scraped out, a shallow pit lined with stone or just a ring of darker peat blocks, blackened by countless small fires. There is no space here for a large blaze. A roaring fire would fill the hut with choking smoke and scorch the low roof. Instead, the heat comes from a few carefully chosen pieces of dried peat, perhaps a sliver of wood, a twist of heather. The flame starts small, then settles quickly into a bed of embers. The smoke rises, curls along the roof, and gradually seeks its way out through the little hole or gap left for it near the peak. On a crude bench or shelf, maybe just a line of flat stones along one wall, someone has left bundles, extra moss, a rolled-up mat of heather or rushes, a few tools. Everything smells strongly of peat, earth, and old smoke. The air is still, but not heavy. It has the feeling of a place that is dried out and been dampened and dried again many times, a space that has learned how to hold a middle ground between clammy and parched. Now picture a small group of workers arriving at this hut after hours of cutting peat on the open bog. Their clothes are dark with moisture, their hands and faces carry fine flecks of peat dust. Each has walked behind a laden barrow or sled, moving blocks from the cut face to drying stacks. Their legs are tired from the constant small adjustments of walking on soft ground. Their socks have surrendered to seepage. They duck into the hut one by one, dropping their tools near the entrance, stamping their feet to shake off the heaviest wet. One kneels by the hearth and encourages the embers, adding a couple of waiting peat blocks and a twist of dried moss or bark to coax a small flame. Another unrolls a mat along the driest part of the floor, while someone else sets up a simple wooden tripod where cloaks and shirts can be draped. Soon the hut fills with the soft sounds of a shared pause, the hiat hiss of wet fabric meeting warm air, the gentle crackle of peat, low conversation or comfortable silence. Steam lifts from sleeves and hems, rising into the murky rafters. The turf walls, having held the day's chill, begin to absorb some of the fire's warmth, radiating it back in a dull, even way. Moss plays its part here as well. A layer of dried moss might be laid on the bench, turning a hard, cool surface into something that doesn't sap heat as quickly from tired muscles. Loose moss may be stuffed into boots, propped close to the hearth so that both leather and filling share the heat. In some huts, a bundle of dry moss is kept as a kind of local reserve, emergency bedding for anyone who must stay out overnight, or padding for a sudden injury. If someone cuts their hand or twists an ankle while working far from home, this hut becomes more than just a resting place. It becomes a tiny clinic. A clean handful of moss is pressed onto a scrape, bandaged with a strip of cloth from an old shirt. Another handful is spread under the injured limb to keep it off the cold floor. The same properties that cushion children in cradles and lined beds in main houses now serve in this rough field shelter, quietly holding warmth and absorbing dampness. Outside, the bog is indifferent. Rain continues if it wishes. Mist fills hollows. The wind roams freely, tugging at the hut's roof edges. But just inside the low doorway, peat and moss have combined once again to push back a little. The hut does not promise luxury. It simply offers less wet, less cold, less wind. Those small reductions mean that a person can eat, rest, or wait out a squall without their strength being drained completely away. In some regions, these huts might also shelter animals overnight, just a few sheep or a cow, bringing their own warmth into the small space. Their breath thickens the air, but their bodies add a slow, living heat that, together with the peat fire, keeps the temperature just high enough to make a difference. Moss at the floor edges absorbs some moisture from hooves and breath, preventing puddles. The turf walls hold steady, neither freezing solid nor dripping incessantly. You can let your imagination slip into the body of a person dozing in such a place. After a small meal, perhaps bread, a piece of dried fish, or hot drink from a simple pot, you curl onto your side on the moss-padded mat. Your damp outer clothes hang near the fire. You lie in your underlayers, wrapped in a cloak that smells of peat smoke and wool. The turf wall is right next to your back, rough but solid. Inside this tiny shelter, sound is softened. You hear the wind outside as a kind of distant sea, sometimes rising, sometimes falling, but never actually reaching you. The fire, burning small and sensible, offers enough warmth for comfort, but not enough to demand attention. Each breath you take brings in air that is cooler near the floor and warmer higher up, mixed with a faint, familiar smokiness. Your feet, which have been wet for hours, now rest near the hearth. The moss in your boots is drying along with the leather, slowly pulling out the day's dampness. When you slip your feet into fresh moss before sleep, it is like sinking into a dry, springy cushion, so different from the cold bog that it almost feels like a trick. The hut knows it will not last forever. The turf blocks in its walls will one day crumble, corners rounding under rain and frost. The roof sods will slip, grass growing longer and more chaotic, until the structure is just another bump on the moor. But while it stands, it is part of a network, a chain of small...
In places where peat and moss ruled the landscape, the year did not move in sharp, clean slices. It flowed slowly and quietly, like water through the bog. Summer blurred into autumn, winter drifted softly into spring. Yet inside that gentle movement, people had very sharp needs. Food had to last. Supplies had to carry across the gap between one growing season and the next. When you live in a land that is always a little too wet, preserving things becomes a careful art. Too much damp and stored food molds or rots. Too much exposure to air, and it dries the wrong way, cracking and spoiling. The bog, with its cool, steady depths, became both a threat and a helper in this effort. It could swallow things and keep them too well, hiding them for centuries, but it could also offer a kind of quiet storage if you understood it and used peat and moss wisely. Imagine the turn of late summer into early autumn in a northern peatland region. The air is softer, a little lower in the sky. In the small fields carved out of better soil, crops are being gathered: oats, barley, root vegetables. Near the shore, fish are salted and hung. In the pasture, animals grow heavy on the last rich weeks of grass. It is a busy, careful time, with everyone's attention bent toward the long, lean months to come. Inside the house, where peat smoke curls under the turf roof, shelves and rafters slowly fill. Dried herbs hang in bunches. A line of smoked fish drifts on a faint draft. Small sacks of grain lean against a peat-lined wall. But not everything can be simply dried and smoked in the open air. Some foods prefer the cool hush of earth, and here peat and moss step in again, not as fuel or bedding, but as guardians of temperature and moisture. Beneath or beside many houses, there might be a small cellar, dug into the slope or into the firmest ground available. It is not grand, just a low space where you must stoop to enter, supported by timber or stone. The floor may be tamped earth or a layer of compacted peat blocks. The walls might be stone-lined with turf or peat itself cut and stacked, its dark surfaces smelling faintly of the bog. Step into such a cellar on a summer day, and you will feel the change at once. The air inside is cooler, heavier, and a little still. The sharpness of sun is gone. Behind you, the doorway glows faintly. Ahead, the space recedes into shadow. Wooden shelves line the walls, and on them rest small barrels, clay jars, and wrapped bundles. On the floor, baskets of root vegetables sit nestled in loose peat or dry moss, their skins protected from sudden swings of temperature or accidental dampness from above. Peat, when dry, is not only a fuel, but also an insulator. Its tangled structure traps air, helping to keep the cellar at a steady coolness. Moss, especially dried sphagnum, can cushion and separate vegetables, turnips, potatoes in later centuries, carrots, stored cabbages, so they do not press and bruise one another. The moss catches stray moisture and keeps pockets of air around each root. You can imagine someone, perhaps at the end of a long harvest day, burying the last of the season's carrots in a box filled with moss and a little dry peat dust. Each vegetable goes in like a small treasure, carefully spaced, then covered over until only a quiet, rustling surface remains. The box is set on a shelf where mice will find it harder to reach and where the faint breath of the cellar can move around it. In some traditions, the bog itself became an extension of this cool, steady storage. It is strange to think of such a wet place used to preserve things. But bog water is not like ordinary water. It is cold, acidic, and low in oxygen. Objects buried in it can remain unchanged for an astonishingly long time, precisely because the normal processes of rot and decay are slowed. The most famous example of this is bog butter, lumps or containers of fat buried in bogs, later found many years or even centuries afterward, still recognizably what they once were. Whether these were meant for short-term storage, long-term preservation, or even as a kind of offering is still debated. But the basic idea is clear. The bog's cool, constant conditions made it a kind of natural refrigerator. Picture someone in an older age preparing a great lump of churned butter or animal fat. They wrap it in cloth or pack it into a wooden vessel. Then, instead of simply leaving it in a warm house where it would soften, melt, and spoil, they carry it out to the peatland. They choose a spot near solid ground where they know they can find it again, perhaps by a particular stone or a certain twisted birch. There they dig down into the peat, past the springy top layers of moss and roots, into the darker, cooler zone where water seeps but does not rush. The smell is deep and sour-sweet, like old leaves and cold tea. Carefully, they lower the bundle in, surrounding it with peat and moss. The materials that once drank in rain now become a gentle cushion and barrier, slowing the change that would normally happen in warmer, more open air. Whether that fat was always intended to be brought back, or whether some buried offerings were meant to stay forever in the bog's keeping, the principle is the same. Peat and moss, combined with cool water and stillness, could hold a moment in time for longer than the open world would allow. Even without such dramatic acts, peatlands offered more modest daily storage tricks. A small pit dug into peat behind the house, lined with dry moss and covered over with turf, could hold perishable food on hot days. The ground's coolness and the insulating power of peat and moss worked together, keeping the interior of the pit much steadier in temperature than the air above. A cloth was laid over the top, then a piece of turf, so that from a distance the hiding place looked just like another small hump in the landscape. If you lift that turf in your imagination now, you might see inside a clay pot of milk or curdled dairy, a bundle of cheese wrapped in a cloth, perhaps some cooked meat meant to be eaten over the next few days. The air in the pit is cool and faintly damp, but not enough to harm what's inside. The peat walls drink in stray moisture, the moss on the floor cradles the containers, and the turf lid shades everything from sun and wind. Beneath larger structures, barns, byres, even the longhouses themselves, people sometimes created deeper storage spaces where peat or turf formed part of the structure. Thick walls of dried peat blocks and sod did more than hold up roofs. They leveled out the sharp edges of winter and summer, creating rooms where potatoes, grain, and cured foods could ride through the seasons with fewer shocks. In such storerooms, the quiet dry was not about making everything brittle and parched. It was about keeping things from ever becoming truly wet or truly hot. That middle ground, A steady coolness, a gentle dryness, allowed the stored harvest to last longer without the dramatic swings that cause expansion, contraction, sweating, and eventually rot. You can see how much attention this required if you imagine a family checking their cellar in midwinter. Outside, the bog is half frozen, its pools rimmed with ice. Snow lies in soft layers on the peat stacks. Wind presses against the turf walls with a low, constant hum. Inside the cellar, it is cold, but not as cruelly cold as outside. A lantern, carried down carefully, reveals shelves of jars and baskets, shadows long and still. Someone reaches down and lifts a cabbage from its nest of moss and leaves. The outermost layers are wilted and stained, but inside, when they peel it back, the vegetable is crisp and usable. A basket of carrots buried in peat dust is checked. A few soft or moldy ones are removed, but most are firm. The family learns, year after year, which arrangements work best. More moss, less peat. More ventilation, less. A slightly higher shelf or a lower one. Moss, once again, proves its value in these small adjustments. If something in storage is too damp, cheese sweating, vegetables softening, adding more dried moss around it often absorbs the excess. If the air in the cellar is too dry and things risk cracking, the moss can be lightly moistened, allowing its stored water to evaporate slowly and rebuild a gentle humidity. It is not precise, not measured with instruments, but with fingers and noses and eyes. The language of too damp.
If water is the patient ruler of bog country, then smoke is its quiet negotiator. It slips between things, between beams and thatch, between cloth fibers, between the tiny cells of dried moss. It does not always smell pleasant in a narrow room, and it can sting the eyes if the wind turns wrong. Yet for people living in landscapes ruled by dampness, smoke, especially the slow, steady smoke of peat, was one of the most reliable tools for creating and keeping dryness. To understand this, imagine yourself stepping into a peatland house on a cold, wet day, somewhere where the horizon is low and the sky hangs close. Outside, the air feels saturated. Even your breath seems to add to the weight of moisture. The bog ground gives softly underfoot, the moss slick with recent rain. But inside the house, another world is at work, shaped by the steady burn of peat blocks gathered and dried over the summer. Peat fires do not behave like eager bonfires of dry pine. They are less about leaping flames and more about glowing embers. A peat block, once lit, often burns slowly from within, its surface dark and crumbly, while its heart smolders red. When several such blocks are arranged in a hearth, whether a simple shallow pit in the floor, a stone-lined firebox, or a low open fireplace, they create a long, steady, quiet heat. Look at the hearth closely. You might see little tongues of flame licking out along cracks, but mostly you see a deep orange-red glow like the inside of a kiln. Above it, the air shimmers. Thin threads of smoke curl upward, then gather into a lazy column that moves toward a smoke hole or chimney. If the house is older and built without a chimney, the smoke might disperse more broadly, darkening rafters and turf, finding its way out through gaps in the roof or at the gable ends. This smoke, drifting and lingering, does more than just carry away the gases of combustion. It moves moisture. Every ember warms the air around it, and warm air can hold more water vapor than cold air. As the air in the house heats up, water seeps out of damp clothing, from wet boots, from moss-filled bedding, from the beams and turf themselves. The smoke and heat mixture rises and flows through the building, and with it goes a constant, slow relocation of water, from surfaces and objects into the air, and from the air to the outside. You can trace that path if you pay attention. Along one wall, a row of heather and moss-filled mattresses has been hung up by day, draped over wooden pegs or ropes. When they were first lifted, they were heavy, holding the night's breath and the day's damp. Now, after hours near the warmth, the outer cloth feels drier to the touch, and if you press your hand against it, there's a faint, earthy warmth. Above, the rafters are darkened by smoke, but beads of condensation no longer cling to them the way they might in a cold, unheated house. Peat smoke also has a particular character. It is cool relative to some other fuels, and it lingers. It does not roar away up a chimney in a rush. It drifts, explores, curls into corners. In doing so, it brushes past exposed moss stuffed into wall cracks, along the fibers of hanging nets, through the weave of drying wool and linen. Wherever it travels, it encourages water to leave. Over time, the walls themselves, peat blocks, turf, stone, and timber, absorb some of this warmth, releasing it slowly back into the room even when the fire dips low. This relationship between peat, heat, smoke, and dampness becomes especially clear in the spaces where people hang things to dry. In many peatland houses, there is a particular zone above and beside the hearth reserved for drying, simple poles or rafters where fish, meat, herbs, nets, clothes, and moss bundles are suspended. The objects hang in a slow-moving river of warm, smoky air. Picture it. Above the fire, several rods of peeled branch or straight saplings are laid parallel, wedged into the gable, or tied to heavier beams. From these, loops of twine or strips of cloth dangle. On one rod hang small fish, their silvery skins now turning matte as they dry and smoke. On another, woven nets drip slowly, their fibers darkening from both moisture and soot. Nearby, a bundle of sphagnum moss, tied up in cloth, twists gently in the rising air. Over days, the fish lose water and gain flavor. The nets become less heavy and less prone to mold. The moss transforms from something that once stood knee-deep in the bog to a tool ready to absorb wetness again, now carrying the faint, bittersweet smell of peat smoke. In each case, the peat fire is not just giving warmth, it is buying dryness, slowly, at the cost of fuel gathered from the bog. The house itself becomes a kind of engine working against the climate outside. When the fire is lit in the morning, the air inside begins colder and damper than anyone would like. Breath fogs in front of mouths. Blankets feel cool and vaguely clammy. The turf roof overhead weeps the night's condensation in tiny, nearly invisible droplets. Hour by hour, as peat blocks glow, the balance shifts. Steam rises from a pot, adding more moisture to the air, but it's caught up in the same movement that carries away damp from the walls and clothing. That mingled cloud of steam and smoke drifts toward the vents, tugged by the slow pull of escaping hot air. The exchange is not swift, but it is continuous. Cool, damp air sinks and moves toward the fire. Warm, smoky air rises and leaves. And while all of this happens, people go about their simple tasks. A person seated by the hearth mends boots, replacing tired moss with new filling that was dried about the fire the day before. Another quietly combs fibers for spinning, the wool or flax loosening more easily in the warm, dryish air. Someone returns from outside, pushing the door open in a gust of cold, wet wind. The room seems briefly invaded, then slowly re-establishes its own climate as the door closes and the hearth reasserts its influence. Over weeks and years, the peat smoke leaves other gifts behind, not always ones we would welcome today, but important then. The inner surfaces of the house become darkened, almost polished with soot. Rafters that might have rotted from constant damp instead are preserved by a thin, tarry layer. Insects find less comfortable purchase in smoke-cured wood. Smells of mold and sourness are replaced, at least in part, by the deep, steady scent of smoldering peat. People, too, carry this scent with them. Their hair, their clothes, even their skin hold faint traces of it, a reminder of the hearth wherever they go. If you met such a person in a field or by the edge of the bog, you could probably guess where they slept at night just by standing downwind. Somewhere under a turf roof, somewhere near a fire that burns slow and deep, instead of quick and bright. In some houses, the animals shared this environment. Cattle, sheep, or goats might occupy the byre end of the longhouse, separated from the family by only a low partition or a raised threshold. Their breath and bodies added their own moisture and warmth to the air, complicating the balance. The peat fire had to dry not just clothes and walls, but also the air exhaled by every living creature under that roof. Yet the presence of animals also added heat and a sense of shared shelter. Their bodies were part of the house's thermal system, if not always its driest component. You can imagine the soundscape on a winter evening. The soft crackle and sigh of the peat hearth, the occasional shifting of a cow, the muted drip of melting snow from boots set near the fire, the low murmur of voices. Smoke threads between all of these, a constant intangible presence. Outside, wind lashes rain or snow across the peat stacks and mossy ground. Inside, you sit with your back to a wall that has soaked up warmth all day and now radiates it back into the room in a barely noticeable but very real way. There is a kind of gentleness to this system. It is not the sharp, immediate dryness of a modern furnace and dehumidifier that can make air feel parched. Instead, it is a balanced, breathing dryness. The house never becomes desert dry. Some moisture always lingers, which helps keep wood from cracking and lungs from aching. But the worst of the damp is continuously pushed back, contained, persuaded to stay outside or to leave gradually through the roof and vents. Moss plays its part here too, in quieter ways. The moss stuffed between logs or in gaps around doors and windows is constantly in contact with the indoor air. When the air is very moist, the moss drinks in that water, swelling slightly. When the hearth has been burning for hours and the air grows warmer and drier, the moss releases some of that stored moisture, slowing down the swing between extremes. It acts like a tiny living buffer, smoothing out the house's breath. Even the peat itself, stacked in neat piles outside against the wall, participates in the conversation between wet and dry.
When land does not know how to be fully solid, people have to learn how to walk differently. In bog country, the ground is not a firm promise, it is a suggestion. Step in the wrong place, and your foot sinks deeper than you expect. Step in the right place, and there is a springy support, a quiet buoyancy under your weight. Over time, this fragile, uncertain ground invited a different kind of building, not tall towers, not deep foundations, but thin, careful lines of path that floated just above the wetness. Peat and moss were not only the stuff of roofs and beds, they also became the material of roads, if you can call them that, in places where ordinary roads would vanish. And while these paths did not always stay dry in the way a stone pavement might, they created a kind of quiet drive for the body. Less sinking, less soaking, fewer sudden surprises underfoot. They offered a stable enough line through an unstable world. Imagine a long stretch of peatland between two firmer places, perhaps a village on one side and winter pasture on the other, or a fishing cove and an inland settlement. The bog lies between like a soft, dark sea. You can walk around it, but that adds hours to every journey. Or you can cross it directly, choosing a route that threads between deeper pools and treacherous patches. Once, long ago, people experimented.
They tried stepping from one tuft of grass to the next, probing with poles, learning which hummocks held firm and which did not. They memorized safe routes as carefully as others might remember a prayer. But memory alone is fragile. Mists can erase landmarks. Snow can level everything into a blank sheet. So, bit by bit, people began to mark and strengthen those routes, turning them into paths that could be found and trusted even in bad weather, and that would spread a traveler's weight across the bog's uneasy surface. One of the simplest ways was to lay logs side by side, a corduroy road. In forests near peatlands, straight trunks or split timbers could be dragged to the bog's edge and then laid across the wet ground in rough parallel. Between them, smaller branches, brush, and layers of moss might be packed to fill the gaps. The result, from above, looked like a long, narrow raft anchored to the land, stretching over the soft ground. Underneath, peat and water still shifted and flexed, but your feet found wood instead of open bog. In other places, especially where timber was scarce, people turned to the bog itself for building material. Peat cut into blocks, dried until firm, could be stacked and laid as a kind of floating causeway. Each block was not exactly light, but compared to stone, it was easier to move across soft ground. Set tightly edge to edge, sometimes held in place with stakes of wood, or anchored at the ends with heavier stones, a peat path could last long enough to make travel less of a gamble. You can picture a group of workers out on the bog in late summer, when the pools are low and the moss at the surface is as dry as it ever gets. They cut peat from nearby, forming neat blocks and laying them in a staggered line, like dark loaves of bread cooling in the open air. Each block goes down with a small, dull thud. As they step on them to adjust their placement, the peat squishes very slightly, then settles. The workers might lay an extra layer of branches and moss on top to smooth out the surface, then tamp it down with their boots. Over time, as travelers pass along this line, the peat blocks compress further. Their outer edges crumble a little, but the internal fibers hold on. Moss colonizes the cracks, sending tiny roots down and knitting the path together. The whole structure floats and adjusts with the bog's mood, rising a bit when the water level goes up, sinking slightly in drier spells, but remaining passable. These paths were not completely dry. In rainy weather, puddles formed along them. In winter, snow buried them. But a traveler on such a route did not usually have to fight suction with every step. The path spread their weight, reducing the risk of one foot suddenly plunging deeper than the other. Boots stayed less soaked, clothing less splattered. This again is the kind of modest, practical dryness that mattered most, not the absence of water, but the absence of surprise. Some of the oldest known trackways in boglands are even more intricate. Archaeologists have found ancient wooden roads laid across peatlands, planks and poles carefully arranged, sometimes with woven branches and layers of brush underneath. In some cases, these were not simple everyday paths, but special routes, perhaps used for ritual processions or to reach important gathering places. Still, they followed the same logic. Create a continuous, somewhat dry line through a shifting, waterlogged world. In a more modest, daily way, smaller paths appeared wherever people repeatedly crossed damp ground. Around farmhouses and cottages built near peatlands, you might find narrow tracks made of turf blocks turned upside down, their root side up, and soil side down. This reversed turf created a surface less immediately muddy than bare earth, with roots and stems acting like a rough mat. Moss once again crept into the pattern, filling small gaps and binding the pieces together. If you were to walk these paths in the early morning, you'd see beads of dew clinging to their surface, pooling lightly in the tiny hollows. But beneath that glittering moisture, the structure stayed holding, firm enough that your foot would not sink past the first impression, enough to keep you out of the worst of the wetness as you carried water from a well, moved peat blocks from pile to hearth, or walked to tend animals grazing on slightly higher ground. The people who made and maintained these paths did so in quiet routines. A sagging section of path might be rebuilt in late summer, when work in the fields allowed a day's effort to be diverted to track repair. A neighbor might mention that a certain stretch felt soft this spring, prompting others to bring extra brush and peat to reinforce it. Children learned where they could step off the path safely and where the ground would swallow their boots up to the ankles. In winter, when frozen bogs appeared firm, those paths were even more important. Under a thin crust of ice, water still waited. A path of timber or peat under snow gave clues, a subtle change in the way the ground sounded underfoot, a slightly higher ridge on a white flat surface. Someone who knew what to listen and feel for could follow the path even when it was invisible, trusting in the memory of where peat blocks or logs had been placed. On stormy days, with rain slanting in from the side, such paths offered another small grace. They kept travelers' attention on a narrow, understandable line. Instead of guessing and worrying about each step, you followed a known sequence. This plank, then that tuft, then the curve by the leaning pine. The world might be a blur of gray and water above your shoulders, but under your feet there was a loose, steady pattern made of peat, wood, and memory. From a distance in time, these pathways seem almost invisible. When they were abandoned, when routes shifted, or villages emptied, or new higher roads were built, bogs began their slow reclamation. Wood rotted, peat blocks crumbled, moss and sedges grew over everything. Centuries later, someone might walk across the same area and feel only a slightly firmer patch underfoot, not knowing that beneath lies the ghost of an old track. Yet the idea remains, even if the materials have changed. Modern walkways across wetland parks, floating boardwalks over marshes, and raised tracks in conservation areas all follow the same quiet principle. Share weight, create a continuous surface, turn an unpredictable environment into one where the body can move calmly, without sudden jolts of cold water and sinking mud. As you let your mind drift now, you can imagine.
If you look at a bog from far away, it seems like the last place you'd expect to find comfort. It looks cold, wet, and patient, a world of puddles and squelching ground, of reeds that whisper in their own language. But if you step closer, and then closer again, you start to see the smaller details. The cushions of moss that spring back under your fingers, the way water pulls away from their surface when you squeeze them, the gentle resilience in every handful. People noticed that softness very early. They noticed the way moss absorbed not just water, but also the tiny discomforts of daily life. Damp socks, aching feet, restless children, small wounds, and tired backs. Slowly, quietly, they turned the bog's strange plant into something that could soften beds, line boots, pad cradles, and soothe injuries. The same material that lived most happily in wetness became a careful tool for creating little pockets of dryness in a world that was always a bit too moist. Imagine a simple house on a long gray day when the air feels heavy and close, like a wool blanket that someone forgot to dry properly. Outside, the ground squishes underfoot. Inside, the floor is packed earth over a layer of peat and sod. There are no sprung mattresses, no piles of factory-made blankets, no rubber boots by the door. Instead, comfort has to be built from whatever the land offers. In one corner of the house, near the wall but away from the door's drafts, someone is preparing bedding. They spread a rough cloth, linen, wool, or even a carefully woven mat on the floor. Then they bring in sacks or bundles of dried moss that were stored up under the eaves or in the rafters, where smoke from the hearth has gently dried them further and chased away insects. When they untie the bundles, the moss loosens with a faint, papery sound. It is no longer wet and springy like it is in the bog, but it hasn't turned brittle either. It is soft, light, and quietly elastic, like a gentle version of straw that doesn't scratch. Handful by handful, they spread it onto the cloth, building up a layer just thick enough to cushion hips and shoulders from the firm floor. The moss doesn't lie perfectly flat. It forms soft hills and small hollows. A second cloth goes over the top, tied or tucked along the edges to keep the filling in place. Lie down on this bed, and you'll feel that the surface moves a little with you. It yields and settles, then holds its shape. If your clothes are a bit damp from the day's work, the moss beneath you doesn't complain. It simply accepts the moisture, pulling it away from your skin and spreading it through its many hollow cells and fibers. By morning, your clothing will be drier, and the moss will be just a little more tired, a little more full. When it has absorbed all it can, the bedding is emptied. The old moss is taken outside to be composted, thrown on a midden heap, or even returns to the edge of the bog. Fresh, dry moss replaces it. It's not a permanent object, this bed. It's a living cycle of plant, water, and use. The bog grows the moss. People dry it and gather it. The bed uses its power to manage moisture. Then the old filling goes back to the earth, and the process begins again. No one thinks of it as recycling. It's simply what you do. Boots and shoes benefit from the same quiet helpers. In climates where everything is often wet, snowstorms in winter, endless drizzle in spring, soggy grass in summer, feet pay the price. Leather stiffens when soaked and dried repeatedly. Wool socks can only hold so much, so people tuck moss into their footwear as a kind of natural insole and dryer. Picture a pair of worn leather boots left by the hearth after a long day out on boggy ground. The outsides are dark and damp, edges stained a deep brown where water has licked up higher than expected. Inside, instead of being simply empty, the boots are loosely stuffed with moss. Some pieces are fresh and pale, others tinged a soft golden color from smoke and repeated use. As the boots sit near the low fire, heat moves gently into them. The leather warms, the moisture inside begins to rise as steam. But before that steam can soak back into the boot's inner surface or condense in cold corners, the dried moss catches it. The plant's old hollow cells eagerly take in the dampness, just as they once did in the bog, but now they are doing it on behalf of human skin. Later, when the boots are emptied, the moss will fall out in clumps that feel heavier than they did before, quietly holding the day's tired sweat and puddle water. Sometimes, on long journeys, travelers carry spare bundles of moss specifically for this. Not because anyone wrote a manual, but because experience has taught them that dry feet mean fewer blisters, fewer infections, and fewer long nights lying awake with burning soles. The moss doesn't solve every problem. It just nudges the body back toward comfort, one handful at a time. Then there are the smallest people in the house, infants who cannot tell you what they need in words, only with restless wiggling and thin cries. In many places, moss became part of their care too. Cradles, wooden boxes, or woven baskets might be lined with soft, dry moss beneath cloth. The moss acted as a quiet, natural cushion that also absorbed moisture and accidents before they could chill tiny bodies. You can imagine a parent, late at night, lifting a drowsy child from a cradle and finding that the cloth underneath is damp, but the child's skin is still warm, not icy and clammy. The moss below has taken the worst of it. In the glow of a peat fire with cold wind pressing against the turf roof, that small difference matters. The moss can be changed the next day, shaken out, dried, or replaced. The child, meanwhile, is kept in the narrow, precious band between too cold and too hot, too wet and too dry. Moss even found its way into some of the quiet emergencies of everyday life. Small cuts, scrapes, and wounds that come from work in rough terrain. Among all mosses, sphagnum is particularly interesting here. Its structure and chemistry give it a gentle, natural ability to discourage some bacteria, and its remarkable absorbency lets it soak up blood and fluids efficiently. Long before laboratory words like antiseptic and sterile were common, people noticed that wounds packed with certain mosses tended to stay cleaner and smell less foul than others. In more recent history, especially during wars like the First World War, dried sphagnum moss was collected in vast quantities, packed into cloth covers and used as wound dressings when cotton was scarce. Its ability to absorb many times its weight in fluid and its mild acidity made it surprisingly effective. But the basic idea, using moss as a clean, dry, absorbent cushion on the body, is much older and much quieter than military records. Picture a shepherd or peat cutter on the bog, decades or centuries ago, slipping with a tool and slicing their hand. The cut is not deep enough to be deadly, but it bleeds and stings. They rinse it in the nearest stream or pool, then press a handful of clean, dry moss over the wound, wrapping it with a strip of cloth or leather. The moss drinks in the blood and holds it, creating a soft, moist but not filthy pad that keeps the cut from rubbing against tools or clothing. At home later, the moss is peeled away and discarded. Fresh moss may take its place. The injury is not magically healed, of course, but it is protected and cushioned by the plant's quiet patience. Somewhere, deep in the peatlands, generations of such stories are layered invisibly, just like the plant remains that form the bog itself. In the same way, herbs and dried plants stored in peat-lined or moss-padded containers stay relatively balanced in moisture, not desiccated into dust, not left to mold too quickly. A small bag of berries, carefully dried and then packed with moss or tucked into a peat-lined nook, might survive a whole season's worth of damp weather without spoiling. The moss never shouts about this work. It simply continues to do what it has always done: manage water, holding just enough and giving up just enough. If you let your thoughts wander through such a house, you can find moss in many corners once you know how to look. In boots by the door, in bedding, in a cradle, stuffed between logs around a window frame, lining a rough wooden bucket to keep it from dripping, nestled under glass bottles or clay pots on a shelf to prevent them from clinking and cracking. It is not a single dramatic invention. It is a soft scattering of solutions, each one helping to create a pocket of dry usefulness inside an otherwise humid world. And through all of this, peat lingers in the background like an older, darker cousin. Cut into blocks and dried, it is stacked by the house, ready to be burned. Though If you stand far enough back from some old northern cottages, especially in the dim light of a cloudy afternoon, they almost disappear into the landscape. The walls are low, the colors are muted, and the roofs do not shine or glare. Instead, they seem to blur into the surrounding hills, their outlines softened by plants. The house does not sit on the earth so much as rise out of it, as if the ground has simply decided to fold itself into a gentle, sheltering shape. Those are roofs made of peat and sod, stitched together with roots and moss. They are not the crisp angles of modern shingles, nor the gleam of metal sheets. They are thick, heavy, and alive, or at least they were once. And inside, under that living weight, people found a kind of dry, steady calm that would be hard to imagine in such a wet climate, if you did not know how peat and moss behave when they are arranged with care. Begin at the very bottom, the house itself. In many damp, windswept regions, builders chose low structures, often half dug into the slope of a hill. The walls might be stone, stacked without mortar, but fitted tightly, or timber logs laid horizontally, or even blocks of cut peat themselves pressed together like bricks. Whatever the material, the house was usually narrow and long, with its shortest face turned toward the prevailing wind. On top of these walls, builders laid a simple frame of beams and rafters, forming the bones of the roof. If the house was timber poor, these might be curved, twisted pieces of wood, scavenged branches, driftwood, or even reused ship timbers. Straightness was nice, but not strictly necessary. The important thing was strength and the ability to carry weight, because what was coming next would be heavy. Layers of turf, peat, and moss. Imagine watching the process on a slow gray morning. The beams are already in place, a basic skeleton rising over the low stone or peat walls. A group of people, family, neighbors, whoever can be spared from other tasks, walk up from the nearby meadow or hillside carrying strips of sod. Each strip is like a rolled-up carpet of earth, grass, roots, and a thin slice of soil underneath, cut with a long-handled spade and lifted carefully so it does not crumble. The pieces are not random. They are chosen from places where the roots have woven a tight mat strong enough to hold together even when lifted off its original ground. First, a layer of thinner brush, twigs, or birch bark might be laid across the rafters. This forms a gentle, flexible skin over the bones, something to catch and support whatever is put above. Birch bark in particular has a quiet genius for this job. It is thin, but stubbornly resistant to water, shedding it away like a natural waterproof membrane. Above that, the turf begins to go on. The first layer is laid with the soil side down, grass side facing the room below. It seems strange if you think about it. Green side in, brown side out. But this arrangement lets the roots wrap around the structure as the turf settles, binding the roof together like a living net. The next layer of turf is placed with the grass side up, the way it grew originally. Soil pressed against soil. Together, these alternating layers form a thick, spongy blanket that is grown, in some sense, twice, once in the meadow, and now again as part of the house. Peat, cut from nearby bogs, might be added as another insulating layer or be used in place of some of the turf. Blocks of peat, once dried enough to hold their shape, could be laid like dark bricks in staggered courses, with their fibrous insides facing downward toward the structure. Over time,
The weight of rain and snow would press everything closer together, making gaps smaller and smaller, squeezing air into tiny pockets that slowed the flow of heat and cold. From a distance, the finished roof looks like a low hill with a house hidden under it. In summer, grasses and little flowers might grow from its surface. Moss creeps in from the edges, seeding itself in any quiet, damp gap. Birds hop along the ridge, pecking for insects. A goat, if someone is careless with their tethering, might even wander up onto the roof as if it were just another patch of grazing land. But when you step inside on a rainy day, the feeling is surprisingly different from the saturated bogs and meadows outside. Rain patters heavily on the turf, but instead of rattling or drumming, the sound is deep and muffled, like someone knocking on a very thick door from far away. The turf and peat drink in the water gradually, spreading it out through all their tiny channels. Only the outer layers become truly wet. Below, the material stays just damp, like a sponge that has not yet reached its limit. This is the quiet dry at work. Again, a peat and moss roof does not reject water with a hard, shiny surface like tiles or metal do. Instead, it accepts it, then slows it, holds it, and offers it back to the air over time. The wooden beams underneath are protected so long as the structure is built with care. There are no sharp points where drips can gather and fall constantly on one spot. Instead, moisture spreads out through the fibers and evaporates slowly whenever wind, sun, or even the mere difference in temperature between inside and outside encourages it. On a winter night, with snow piled thick on top of the roof, the effect is different but equally gentle. Snow on turf acts like an extra blanket of trapped air, further slowing the escape of warmth. Inside, the peat and moss layers above you are not exactly heating the room. They do not create warmth, but they are very good at keeping the day's hard-won heat from escaping too quickly. The glow from a small peat fire, burning low and steady in the hearth, rises and curls into the room. The temperature does not spike or plummet. It lingers. You can almost feel it if you lie down on a simple bed along the wall and look up. Above you, instead of thin boards rattling in the wind, there is this thick, earthy weight. You know, in a practical way, that it is holding back rain and snow, but it also feels as if you're sleeping underneath a piece of the land itself, which has agreed, for a while, to curve around you like a protective shell. Of course, such roofs required care. Grass and moss grow and die. Roots slowly shift. Animals burrow. If the turf began to slip or sag, if channels formed where water could gather, then dampness could creep inward. From time to time, a family member or two or three would climb up with spades and simple tools, cutting fresh pieces of sod, tamping down loose patches, smoothing out dips. Moss might be encouraged here, peeled away there. Even the choice of where to cut turf or peat for building was part of this careful rhythm. People knew, by trial and error, which parts of the hillside or meadow produced the best, strongest sod. Not too thin, not too gritty, with roots that ran deep and even. They learned that peat cut from certain depths in the bog was denser, better for stacking as blocks, while peat from other layers crumbled too easily. Knowledge was passed quietly in remarks like, "Don't cut too close to the stream edge," or "This patch by the old birch roots holds better." Inside the house, the effect of all this patient work was simple and slowly miraculous. Things remained usefully dry. Not bone dry, not brittle and cracking, but dry enough. Dry enough that clothes would finish drying overnight rather than staying clammy for days. Dry enough that bedding, even if it sometimes felt cool to the touch, did not smell of mold. dry enough that stored grain and dried fish did not rot quickly on the rafters. You might picture shelves carved into thick turf or peat walls, lined with wooden boards. Upon them, bundles of herbs, woven mats, little bags of seeds, folded cloth. The air inside is not desert dry. You can still see your breath in winter, but the small, crucial boundary between damp and wet is maintained. The house holds a steady middle ground in a world of extremes. Soaked marsh outside, icy wind above, yet a gentle, usable dryness at the center. Even at the microscopic level, the peat and moss are still working. Their fibers, hollow cells, and tiny channels are constantly negotiating with water.
If you've ever walked out into an old bog in late evening, you know that the world there does not move quickly. It is a place that does not hurry, a place that has stacked time on itself in slow, quiet layers. Every step sinks just a little, as if the earth is remembering thousands of years of rain, of fog, of snowmelt and dripping clouds. And yet, under all that softness, under all that damp, a strange kind of dryness hides. This is the quiet story of peat and moss, the plants that learned to live in wetness so completely that they began, paradoxically, to control water. They built their own slow shields, layers that could keep fire, warmth, and people dry in lands that otherwise never quite stopped being wet. Imagine yourself in an old northern landscape, where the air is cool even in summer, and the ground feels like a soaked carpet underfoot. The horizon is low, the sky wide and pale. Small pines lean into the wind, their trunks twisted like they have been thinking for too long. Between them, peatland, moss and soft cushions, pale green and rusty red, stretching away like a quiet, lumpy quilt. Under that moss, things are happening so slowly that you could lie down and sleep for a whole night, a whole season, a whole lifetime, and still not catch them in the act. Plants grow, die, and do not fully vanish. Year after year, they sink as thin, brown ghosts into the waterlogged ground. There isn't enough air for them to fully rot. Instead, they become peat, half-decayed plant matter, packed together by time, squeezed flat and dark. In many places on Earth, people learned that this strange halfway material could be turned into something useful, not just as fuel, that part comes later, but as a way to survive in a world where water seeped into everything. Before stoves, before bottled gas, before synthetic insulation, peat and moss were quiet tools, helping keep feet dry, fires steady, and houses warmer than the wind would like them to be. To understand how, you have to start with moss itself. Sphagnum moss especially, the small star-shaped plant that forms thick carpets in bogs. It is a water magician. Each tiny plant can hold many times its own weight in water, not only in its cells, but in special hollow structures that act like miniature sponges. When it rains, when mist falls, when snow melts, sphagnum drinks deeply and keeps drinking, turning a bog into a vast living reservoir. For a traveler crossing this land on foot, that reservoir is mostly trouble. Every step squishes. Your boots, if you have them, darken and grow heavy. The water finds ways in along seams and laces, up your socks, under your trousers. The moss accepts your weight, then slowly allows it to sink, the way a mattress remembers whoever lies down on it. But for a person who learns to live with this landscape, sphagnum's thirst becomes a quiet ally. Dry it, and that same sponge power can be redirected. Dried moss laid underfoot inside a hut can soak up the day's drips, the melted snow by the doorway, the condensation that creeps down cold walls at night. In some houses, builders would lay a cushion of moss along each join, between log and log, between timber and stone. With time, the moss would settle and compress, but it would still cling to stray moisture, keeping it from blowing further into the living space. In places where winters were long and roofs sweated in the thaw, People would lift up planks or mats and replace the tired, soggy moss with fresh, dry handfuls brought in from sunny days. You can picture it. A quiet afternoon in late summer when the bog's surface is warm and humming with small insects. A family, or perhaps a single careful worker, moves slowly over the ground, choosing patches of moss that have grown thick and springy. They pull it up in gentle sheets, squeezing the extra water away, stacking it in a simple woven basket or on a sled. Back at home, the moss is spread in thin layers over flat stones, boards, or even the sloping roof of the house itself. There, in slanting sunlight and steady wind, something wet becomes something dry. And yet not brittle, not dead, just ready. Peat itself is another step in this long conversation between water and dryness. Where moss has only lived a few seasons, peat is old. Dig down into a bog and each spadeful is like a page from the past. Layer on layer of compressed stems, leaves, roots. Dark brown at the top, almost black deeper down. This material, once cut into blocks and laid out to dry, becomes lighter, crumbly, and, most importantly, burnable. But even before you light a peat fire, dried peat has a gentler, quieter use. Stack it carefully against the outer wall of a house, and you get more than just future fuel. You get an extra layer of insulation, a dark, dry shield against persistent damp. If rain lashes at the walls, it first strikes the peat. The outermost pieces darken and drink the water. The inner pieces stay drier, acting like a buffer. Wind sweeps by, pulling moisture off the exposed faces. Over days, this dance repeats, wet, then dry, then wet again. Meanwhile, inside, a family can sit by the hearth with their clothes slowly steaming on a line, their bedding hanging just close enough to catch gentle warmth but not sparks. Further north, where the sun lingers only briefly in winter, peat also becomes part of the floor itself. In some cottages, after leveling the earth, people would lay a thick layer of sod and peat with the growing side down and the dark, dense part up. Over that would go simple boards or sometimes just layers of rushes, straw, and cloth. The peat base stayed cool and firm, but its structure helped break the upward creep of dampness from the ground. Imagine walking barefoot across such a floor on a late autumn evening. Outside, the bog breathes out mist as the air cools. Inside, the floor feels not exactly warm, but softly dry. The boards have a slight give under your weight. Near the hearth, the wood is warm. Near the door, cooler, but still not cold in that sharp, bone-deep way that bare hearth can be. The peat beneath everything is not something you see or even think about often. It is simply there, doing its work in silence. Survival in such climates was not about winning against wetness, but about learning to redirect it, to store it, to slow it down. Moss lined cradles to keep babies drier through long nights, absorbing the small accidents that would otherwise chill them. It lined boots as a kind of disposable, natural insole, taking in sweat and meltwater before it could sit against the skin too long. Travelers would sometimes carry a small bundle of dry moss in their packs, a little cluster of potential dryness to spread under a bedroll or inside damp mittens. The moss did not last forever. After a time, it would break down, smell of old water, and need to be replaced. But that too fit the rhythm of the bog. As people removed old moss from their homes, they could return it to the edge of the wetlands, where it joined the slow, sinking layers of future peat. New moss would grow in its place. The system was circular, unhurried. No one talked about waste management. They simply followed the patterns the land suggested. If you listen closely to this kind of history, you can hear that it is less about sudden inventions and more about long observation. Someone noticed, perhaps long ago, that a stick left on the ground beside a hearth for days remained damp. But a block of peat, once dried, stayed dry inside even when its surface darkened after a storm. Someone noticed that a child sleeping on moss-filled bedding woke warmer and less clammy than one lying directly on cloth over earth. These small discoveries accumulated across generations, becoming habits, then customs, then the proper way to do things. Today, we might speak of insulation values and moisture management, measure humidity with electronic sensors, and pack our walls with carefully rated materials. In the peatlands and mossy bogs of the past, such measurements were taken by hand, by breath, by the feeling of socks in the morning, and the sound of winds sneaking or not sneaking through the cracks at night. But behind both worlds lies the same quiet goal: to carve out a small, reliably dry space in an otherwise restless climate. As you drift towards sleep, you can picture that small space clearly. A low house half sunk into the groundwork of peat, walls chinked with moss, a soft crackle from a peat fire that doesn't flame as high as wood, but glows deep and steady, like embers remembering old summers. Boots drying on a simple rack, their inside stuffed with fresh, springy moss that will be shaken out in the morning. Outside, the bog continues its patient work. Rain falling, water held, plants slowly sinking into future peat. Inside, for tonight at least, the air is gently dry, the blankets are warm, and the quiet labor of moss and peat is almost done. You do not need to go anywhere or do anything. Just lie there in your quiet room and imagine that soft, spongy landscape holding the day's moisture far away from your skin, storing it in layers of green and brown. The world outside can be as wet as it likes. Here, wrapped in the careful work of plants and time, you can simply breathe and rest.
To look at a wide peat bog is to think, at first, that nothing orderly could ever grow there. It is all soft edges and wandering water, hummocks where moss piles up, hollows where brown pools lie still, reeds that sway wherever they please. It seems like the opposite of a field, which is straight lines and predictable rows, earth that waits calmly for seeds. And yet, people in peatland country still needed grain, vegetables, hay. You cannot live on smoke and moss alone. So they did something very patient and very quiet. They borrowed small pieces of the bog and taught them, bit by bit, how to behave more like fields, never entirely dry, but just dry enough. Imagine standing at the edge of a peatland settlement in early spring when the snow has melted, but the ground is still heavy with water. Beyond the low houses, the bog stretches away, glistening in the pale light. Closer to you, though, the land begins to change. You see lines, ditches, raised strips, ridges and furrows, softened by moss and grass, but unmistakably shaped by human hands. These are the borrowed fields. No one owns them in quite the same way they might own a dry hillside. They exist in an ongoing negotiation with the water beneath. Some years they will behave. Some years they will sulk, turning back into marsh. But when they cooperate, they can carry a surprising amount of life. The first step in making such a field is not adding anything, but taking something away. Water. Not all of it. If you drained the bog completely, it would crumble and crack. Just enough to lower the water table a little, to keep the surface from acting like a soaked sponge every time you step on it. So people dig ditches. The work is slow, heavy, and often done in the chill of early or late seasons when other tasks press less urgently. A line is marked, perhaps following a natural hollow or tracing a boundary between slightly higher and lower ground. Spades and turf-cutting tools bite into the moss and upper peat, lifting out long strips. The removed material is not thrown away. It is piled beside the ditch, making a low ridge. Over time, as the ditch cuts deeper, water finds its way into it from the surrounding peat.
The ditch becomes a small, narrow canal, carrying away what would otherwise have soaked the whole surface. The ridges built from the dug-out turf and peat dry more quickly than the land around them. They are a little higher, a little firmer, a little more ready to hold seeds. If you look across such reclaimed ground from a short distance, you might see a pattern of parallel stripes, ditch, ridge, like quiet breathing across the land. In between them, the bog is still itself, wet, spongy, flashing with water in low spots. On the ridges, though, something different can happen. Here, a plow, perhaps pulled by a small horse or a pair of sturdy people, can pass without sinking too deeply. Here the soil is a mixture of peat and whatever bits of mineral earth lie close beneath, improved gradually with ash from the hearth, droppings from animals, and scattered plant remains. Moss plays its part in this transformation too. On the ridges, the moss that survives is often the tougher kind, able to handle occasional dryness and trampling. Its slow growth, its fine roots, help tie the friable peat together so that the ridges do not simply slump back into the ditches. On the ditch edges, bright sphagnum and other wet-loving species form a soft lining, protecting the banks from falling in all at once, and filtering the water that slips through. In some places, people cut sod from slightly drier parts of the landscape, thin layers of grass-covered turf, and lay them on the ridges, building a more solid skin over the peat. The roots of this turf reach down and knit into the soft material below, making something that behaves more like conventional soil. Over years, as plants grow and die, as ash and muck are added, the borrowed land becomes more convincingly field-like. But it never forgets what it is. In a very wet year, the water rises again, the ditches brim, and the ridges grow heavy. Seeds may rot instead of sprouting. Roots may sit too long in cold, sour water. In a very dry year, the peat can crack, the ridges sinking and shifting. The people who work these fields learn to read the small signs, the way the ditches fill and empty, the color and texture of the moss along their edges, the firmness underfoot. You can imagine a family walking their fields in springtime, boots leaving soft impressions on the ridges, the ditches beside them filled with slow-moving water the color of weak tea. They stop, kneel, and press their hands into the soil. Is it too cold, too saturated? Are there worms, beetles, signs of movement? The moss growing among the clumps tells its own quiet story. New, fresh green tips mean the surface has survived the winter well. Slimy rotting patches in the wrong places warn that water sat too long. When the time is right, they sow, not with the careless broadcast of seeds on a dry, eager field, but with measured trust. Barley, oats, root crops suitable for cool and damp climates, each has its place. The seed falls into shallow furrows, is covered over, and then left to negotiate with the borrowed ground. As the weeks pass, the ridges change color. Where they were once a dull peat brown with scattered moss, they now show thin lines of green, then thicker bands as plants emerge. The contrast between ridge and ditch becomes sharper. Growing stalks on the raised strips, dark water in bright sphagnum in the low channels. From above, it might look like music laid over the bog, a quiet score of alternating wet and dry, green and brown. Working such fields is not easy. Rain makes them greedy again. The peat swells and boots squelch with each step. But the ditches, if kept clear, carry away the worst of the excess. Moss along the banks hold the edges together, its roots and stems acting like small hands. On days when the weather cooperates, soft clouds, a mild breeze, the ridges can feel almost like ordinary farmland, the ground firm enough to kneel while weeding, and the air smelling of damp soil and growing things instead of just raw peat. After harvest, the borrowed nature of these fields shows up once more. Stubble remains on the ridges, golden against the darker ground. Some of it is cut and carried home for bedding, some left to be pressed into the peat by autumn rains and winter snow. Animals may be turned out to graze the aftermath, their hooves tamping down plant remains and their droppings adding slow nourishment. Peat and moss interact with all of this in a long, patient cycle. Peat under the ridges takes in roots, broken stems, spilled grain. Moss in the ditches filters the runoff from fertilized fields, catching nutrients that might otherwise rush away. In this way, the bog is both exploited and, in a small way, healed. Material taken from it to dry houses and feed fires, then returned in altered form as compost and runoff. At the very edges of these fields, you often find transitional zones, half bog, half pasture, where sedges, moss, and grass mingle. Here people might cut hay in high summer, picking their way carefully so not to sink. The hay, once dried on lines or simple frames, becomes winter bedding for animals, who in turn contribute manure for the ridges. A loop forms. Bog plants feeding animals, animals feeding fields, fields feeding people, and people, through their waste and labor, feeding the bog again. In all of this, dryness is not a fixed goal, but a shifting threshold. The ridges never become bone-dry dust. They remain cool, with moisture tucked away deeper down. The ditches never vanish. They continue to carry water, reflections of sky, the occasional visiting bird. The point is not to...
If you could slice a peat bog straight down the middle and open it like a book, you would not see blank pages. You would see time. Thin, soft, countless pages of it, layer upon layer of brown, gold, and black. What seems, from above, like one uniform softness is in fact a quiet archive, built slowly by mosses and sedges and grasses as they lived, died, and refused, stubbornly, to disappear. Most places on Earth do not keep such careful records. When plants die in a dry meadow, they crumble, blow away as dust, and turn back into soil under a sky that moves air freely. In a forest, fallen leaves are chewed quickly by fungi and small creatures, returning to the earth in a fast, lively cycle. But in a bog, where moss and water run the show, the rules change. There is water everywhere, but not much air. Rot, which usually hurries, slows down until it is more like a long, thoughtful pause. Start at the top, the living surface, where sphagnum moss forms bright, springy cushions, and small plants poke up like thoughts half-formed. This is the present moment. Here, raindrops land, glint briefly, and either soak in or slide away. Insects flicker. A bird lands, hops lightly, and takes off again. If you press your hand into the moss, it yields, cool and damp, then rises, leaving your palm faintly scented with green. Just below that thin, living skin are the remains of last year's growth, stems and leaves that have begun to lose their shape, turning from clear structures into softer, darker threads.
They are still recognizably plant, but their edges are blurring. In a normal meadow, this layer would be thinner and more temporary, quickly consumed by decay. In the bog, it is the beginning of a very deep stack. Go deeper, at least in your imagination, since it is more comfortable than actually sinking into cold peat. Inch by inch, the layers grow darker. Each one was once the surface of the bog, a moss carpet beneath the sky. Year after year, fresh growth covered what came before, gently pressing it into the wet, low-oxygen world below. The older material softened, but did not vanish. It became peat. Peat is not quite soil and not quite plant. It is something in between, a tangle of partially decayed fibers, hollow stems, collapsed but still present, leaves flattened into thin shadows of themselves. It feels spongy when wet, crumbly when dry. If you cut a block from a bog and hold it in your hands, you are holding decades, sometimes centuries of summers and winters pressed together into one quiet shape. People living around these bogs learn to read this layered time in simple ways. A fresh cut in the peat face, where blocks were being taken for fuel, revealed different zones. The topmost few spans were light brown and fibrous, full of recognizable plant pieces. Below that, the peat grew denser, darker, more homogeneous. At certain depths, you might even find a thin layer of sand or ash, evidence of some long-ago storm, flood, or distant volcanic dustfall. They may not have kept calendars the way we do now, but they knew something important. The deeper the peat, the older it is. A peat bank that had been cut for several generations would expose dark, ancient layers at its base. Children might run their fingers along the face, feeling the shift from soft, newer peat to something more compressed below. Elders might point and say, "That layer was already old when my grandfather was born." From our modern viewpoint, we know that peat archives even finer details. Pollen grains from plants that flowered long ago, seeds, tiny shells, fragments of insects. Scientists can take slender cores from peat bogs and see, in H-millimeter, hints of climates and landscapes long vanished, forests that once stood nearby, crops that began to be cultivated, times when fires were more common. The bog remembers without trying to, simply by being a place where things sink and stay. But long before scientists with glass vials and microscopes arrived, the people who lived with peat understood that bogs held on to things. Sometimes they held on to them so well that they came back centuries later, oddly unchanged. A wooden tool dropped and lost in the bog could occasionally be found generations later, darkened but still intact, where in other soils it would have rotted away. Imagine someone centuries ago losing a small wooden rake or a fragment of harness into a soft patch of ground. It sinks quickly, pulled down by water and the delicate collapse of the moss underfoot. There is a moment of searching, prodding with a pole, then resignation. The bog has taken it. Life goes on, a new tool is made, and the spot is avoided for a while. Now imagine in a much later age someone cutting peat from that very same area. Their spade bites into the dark mass, lifting block after block onto a barrow. At some point, the metal edge of the tool hits something that is not plant, not stone. They kneel, pull back the soft peat, and uncover a piece of shaped wood, stained black, as though carved from the bog itself. The tool's maker is long gone, yet their object remains, carried upward by the slow, patient movement of peat being cut away. Even without knowing the exact age, the message is clear. This place keeps. It doesn't just swallow, it stores. Not only tools, of course, but shoes, wooden vessels, chunks of timber, sometimes even bits of fabric or rope, all the small things that fall from human hands into water. The bog's partial dryness, the withholding of full decay, means these objects are neither alive nor gone. They rest in a long in-between, like thoughts put aside, but never quite forgotten. This strange preservation can be unsettling when it involves once living bodies, and the stories of bog bodies are better suited to bright afternoons than to bedtime. But even there, if you consider it gently, it is part of the same pattern. The bog's refusal to rush. Where open ground would cycle remains back into soil quickly, the peatland slows every process down until past and present sit close together, separated only by a few layers of moss and thyme. People used this property in quieter ways too. We already imagined bog butter, fat hidden in peat, kept cool and slow-changing. But there are other small examples. A carved wooden stake pushed into the bog to mark a boundary could last far longer than one driven into dry soil, its lower half preserved in the damp, acidic peat. A fence line that elsewhere would rot away in a few seasons might linger here as a ghost line of darkened posts, still standing, still whispering of past divisions. For a person walking across this landscape day after day, the knowledge of such hidden time might hover faintly in the mind. You might cross what looks like ordinary moss and water, knowing that somewhere beneath there could be the remnants of old paths, lost tools, forgotten offerings, or even old shorelines from when the bog was a lake. The place under your feet is not merely mud, it is layered memory. And yet, on the surface, life goes on in a very present-tense way. Sheep graze on drier margins. People walk the floating paths they built from logs and peat blocks. Children play near peat stacks, carving small figures from dried pieces. Adults work, eat, sleep, scarcely thinking about the depths below, unless the bog reminds them with a surprising find. In the peatland house, this deep time sits literally under the floor. The peat blocks used for walls and roofs, the fuel feeding the hearth, are all slices of years bundled into useful forms. When someone leans against a peat wall warmed by the fire, they are resting their shoulder against decades of summers. When they place another block on the hearth, they are asking long-ago sunlight, stored by moths and grass, to release its warmth now. If you hold a dried peat brick in your hands, you can think of it as a kind of folded timeline. Each fiber came from a plant that grew in water-soaked light, reaching
in a place where everything seems to be water. You might not think much about drinking it. There are pools and rivulets, slow streams sliding through peat, rain that falls often enough to feel almost constant. But raw bog water is not always what the body wants. It can be dark with tannins, heavy with tiny floating bits of plant, cold enough to ache in your teeth. It is everywhere, and yet not always ready. So in peatland country, people learned not only how to keep water away from their skin when they needed to be dry, but also how to soften and filter it when they needed to drink, cook, and wash. Once again, peat and moss were quietly involved, not in a dramatic, modern purification system, but in a scatter of small, steady practices that turned harsh, murky water into something gentler and more useful. Imagine the surface of a peat bog after steady rain. Pools collect in hollows, their surfaces brown and glossy, like old tea. When you kneel and look closely, you see reflections of sky broken by tiny raindrop rings. Below that, a slow swirl of fine debris, specks of leaf, threads of decayed stems, invisible life that rides the water wherever it goes. It is not poisoned, but it is not clear. People did not have microscopes, but they had mouths and noses and long memory. They knew that some water felt better to drink than others. A shallow pool warmed by sun and thick with insect life might be fine for animals, but not for humans. A spring rising from beneath gravel on the edge of the peatland had a different taste. Colder, clearer, a bit stony. A small stream that had wandered too far through decomposing plant matter tasted more bitter, more boggy. So they paid attention. Springs were marked and visited. Wells were dug near places where the underground flow met firmer ground, pulling water from beneath the peat. In some cases, peat itself was used to guide and filter that water, packed into walls and channels so that what emerged on the other side had already passed through a kind of living, earthy sieve. If you picture a simple water collecting place near a peatland home, it might look like this: a shallow depression, lined with stone or timber, fed by a small, steady trickle from a spring higher up the slope. Around and beneath that spring, peat forms spongy layers, soaked but compressed, its dark fibers holding back larger bits of debris. Moss clings to edges, its dense stems helping trap sediment and fine particles. By the time the water reaches the household pool, it has been slowed, pressed, and sifted, emerging clearer and gentler than the open bog water nearby. In some traditions, people used moss more directly as a kind of filter. A wooden ladle or simple spout might be lined with a layer of clean, fresh sphagnum. Water poured through it did not turn crystal clear, but some of the coarser material stayed behind. More importantly, as the water spread through the moss's tiny hollow cells, it lost a little of its harshness. Temperature evened out. Sharp tastes softened. You can imagine someone filling a container this way. They kneel by a peat-edged stream where the water is already moving and a little clearer than the still pools. They dip a clay jug or wooden bucket, but before they pour it into the household storage vessel, they strain it through a moss-lined funnel. Perhaps just a rolled piece of bark or leather with moss packed inside. The water dribbles out more slowly than it went in, catching the light in a thin, steady stream. When the moss is full of silt and darkened, it is discarded back onto the bog's edge, where it will eventually join the long process of becoming peat. Moss served as a filter in other, subtler ways as well. In houses where peat and turf formed thick walls and roofs, the water that arrived indoors, whether from melting snow in a pot, saved rainwater in a barrel, or water carried from a spring, was often stored in cool, moss-padded places. A jar might sit on a bed of moss to prevent sudden temperature changes and to catch any drips. Barrels used to keep water were sometimes wedged with moss around their bases to prevent damp rings that would rot floorboards or earthen surfaces. If you think of dryness not as an absolute state, but as a controlled relationship between water and everything it touches, moss's role becomes clearer. It stands at the boundary, absorbing little excesses before they become problems. A spill near the door? A handful of moss spread over the patch turns a slick puddle into a damp area that will dry quietly. A bucket sweating with cool water on a warm day? Moss around its base catches the slow drip, keeping it from spreading and making the floor treacherous. Peat, too, shaped water's path on a larger scale. In many landscapes, peatlands act like vast, patient sponges, absorbing rainfall, storing it, and releasing it slowly into streams and rivers. For people living in and near these areas, that meant that downstream water often had a peculiar stability. Even in dry spells, there might be a low but constant flow, fed by the bog's long memory of rain. In wet times, the peat's capacity to soak up surplus water prevented sudden, catastrophic floods, at least before drainage and cutting disturbed the system. Villages built near such peat-fed streams learned to trust them as steady sources. Wells dug into peat-influenced ground retained their coolness in summer and resisted freezing completely in winter. Water drawn from them might be tinted and carry the faint taste of the bog, but it would rarely disappear altogether. The bog's vast body moderated the extremes. Inside the home, this moderation continued in the way water was handled. Washing clothes in a peatland house was often a slow affair, scheduled for times when enough water could be spared, and when it was warm enough that dampness could be driven off more easily afterward. Moss sometimes entered the process as a gentle scrubber, its fibrous texture able to lift grime from rough wool without cutting it the way sand or harsher tools would. Used moss, now carrying dirt and soap, was then returned outdoors, where rain and soil slowly reclaimed it. Bathing likely was not a daily luxury, but when it happened, it too was shaped by the logic of quiet filters and gentle water. A basin lined with moss might be used to soften the impact of cold water on tired feet. Moss could be turned into a loose pad or washcloth, dipped and wrung out, then passed over skin to remove sweat and mud. It held enough water to be effective, but not so much that it dripped everywhere, soaking floors unnecessarily. In small, practical ways, peat helped too. Ash from a peat fire, once cooled and handled carefully, could be mixed with water to create a simple lye, a weak cleaning solution. This water, passed through moss or poured slowly through a peat-lined trough, might be used to wash particularly greasy items or to help strip oils from wool before spinning. The peat's own chemistry and structure influenced how quickly such mixtures moved, how clear they became after settling, and how they felt on skin. If you step back and look at all of this from a distance, you see a pattern. Water everywhere, but always being slowed, guided, and softened by moss and peat. Outside, bog pools are held in place by spongy moss carpets and deep peat layers. Streams leaving the bog carry a memory of that slow passage. Inside, water for drinking and washing is strained, settled, and cushioned by smaller pockets of the same materials. Spills and excess damp are continually caught and tamed by moss at the thresholds, around containers, under tools. The result is not a dry world, far from it. It is a place where wetness is nearly constant, but rarely allowed to be violent or sudden within the spaces humans have claimed. Water arrives in the house in buckets and jugs, but it leaves in the form of steam drifted out through peat and moss-guided channels. It appears on the floor briefly, then vanishes into moss mats. It condenses on walls and ceilings only to be soaked up and released again slowly. As you rest and let these images pass, you might imagine yourself sitting at a simple table in such a house. Before you is a wooden cup or a thick clay mug half full of cool water drawn from a spring that runs along the edge of a peatland. The water is not perfectly clear, but it is clean enough, smooth in the mouth. The cup leaves a faint ring on the table, which is quietly absorbed by a strip of moss laid there for just that purpose. Nearby, a bucket sits on the floor, its base cushioned by a dark mat of peat crumbs and moss that catches any drips. Beyond that, by the door, a small patch of floor is layered with dried moss and rushes, where people wipe their feet as they come in, leaving some of the bog's wetness there instead of carrying it across the whole room. In a corner, a bundle of fresh moss waits to be used for filtering, scrubbing, or padding. No fixed assignment, just a readiness to manage water